to the debate. Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres' visit to Pakistan. He arrived earlier today, and of course he has been engaged with meaningful conversations with his counterparts in Pakistan. This is of course a solidarity visit in the aftermath of the devastating floods that have affected more than 33 million people in the country. There have been numerous engagements with regards to international donors, international partners coming in and supporting Pakistan in terms of aid and technical assistance. There's also an appeal that has been supported by the UN Secretary General of $160 billion with regards to the kind of help that is needed by our international partners as well. The UNSG on his visit and in his press conferences today iterated the fact that this is of course something that Pakistan is facing the consequences of, even though it contributes less than 1% to global carbon emissions. And so he talked about how this is nature's way of getting back at us, so that we need to be able to put up stronger measures, and especially those countries that contribute more towards climate change need to do better. This also, of course, was followed up by a massive appeal to the international partners as well to come forward and help Pakistan. We had earlier seen estimates given of around $30 billion in loss and damages, which of course now, as the situation gives us more data, has been quoted as $30 billion also by the UNSG. And we of course know that this number seems to keep on increasing as and when we find more information and as we progress into this particular relief and rehabilitation effort. We also know, of course, that there are more forecasts of rain. There is potential more devastation that can happen within Pakistan. And then there's also the long-term rehabilitation process that requires a lot of resources and support, which is what the UNSG also quoted as saying is something that we need sustained support from. Of course, largely all of this contributes to the fact that when Pakistan is dealing with a natural disaster, there is conversation regarding how this is something that is actually human-induced, is man-made in terms of the kind of impact that this has on the potential issues of climate change all around the world, and how there needs to be a global collective action. So we will be taking a look at the current flood situation of the country, and also taking a look at the visit of the UNSG and the way that it's going to impact help from international partners, and how we can proceed forward and develop a plan in terms of what we need to do, and talk about the kind of measures that Pakistan needs to be taking, as well as involving more and more international partners on record as well. Of course, we're going to be talking about all of this, and for this we have been joined as always by senior analyst Farooq Satafi. We've also been joined by Daber Bad, who's an environmentalist. We've been joined by Muhammad Abdullah Deol, who's a water scientist, and also by Dr. Asif Javed, an environment expert. This is, of course, something that we'll talk about as we move on in the show. But let me start with you, Farooq. Of course, the UN Secretary General's visit was something that we were all looking forward to in terms of the impact it's going to have on the way the flood situation and the kind of damages and losses that Pakistan has incurred so far is going to be taken in by other countries around the world as well. So far, there has been, of course, a lot of conversation around how there needs to be sustained support from our international partners. We have had a lot of help, but then when we talk about the scale of damages, it seems that we will be needing much more. First of all, your comments on the UNSG's visit so far and his comments regarding sustained help from international partners.
Sana, let me actually begin by expressing my gratitude on the outpouring of support that we have witnessed so far. Secretary General's visit is most welcome because it draws attention to Pakistan's suffering at this moment. And then we have also seen that the head of USAID is also in Pakistan, and so is the international media. So today, when I was listening to the Secretary General's speech, I thought that it was something that actually came directly from his heart. He is very articulate, of course, but the way he has actually, highlighted Pakistan's suffering, Pakistan's problems at this moment because of the environmental, or climate change, that was very helpful. That is not all. If you remember, we have been talking about the overall assessment of the damages so far, and there was a number, $10 billion for quite some time, and then for quite some time we kept on hearing that perhaps the estimates could go beyond that. Today, the Secretary General actually spoke, and he mentioned the number $30 billion. So the world is watching, the world is evaluating our suffering and problems as well. And I think that this was most welcome visit, and in coming days we are going to see, because of this, the problem will be further highlighted, and the world will come in aid of Pakistan.
Absolutely, and that is, of course, the hope. Dr. Asif, when we take a look at, of course, the kind of situation that Pakistan is dealing with, there has been a lot of issues highlighted with regards to how perhaps Pakistan has faced floods in the past, especially the ones in 2010. Of course, the kind of barrels that are being drawn is something that we all understand is very different in terms of the scale and damages that we have seen. But they were unprecedented when they happened, and then when we talk about these floods, these have become unprecedented now, and we don't want any worse floods to occur and them becoming unprecedented. When we take a look at the kind of impact that climate change has on Pakistan, of course, the impact is happening continuously and not just when such a disaster occurs. There is still potential risk that exists even if we're not involved currently in a natural calamity. There's obviously also the discussion that a lot of this is not limited to just being called as a natural disaster. This is in fact something we need to take responsibility for at a collective level, and is in fact man-made. When you take a look at the kind of patterns that exist and the kind of potential risks and consequences that Pakistan carries in terms of climate change, what sort of issues do you think need to be highlighted in terms of our understanding of these climate change patterns? Are we aware in terms of what Pakistan is facing currently or will be facing in the near future? Are we even closer to understanding the changing patterns within our country, and then also developing similar strategies along the way?
Thank you, Sana. First of all, I also welcome the UN Secretary General's visit to Pakistan. It will draw up the attention of international community towards Pakistan in a more effective way. Sana, we have been consistently talking about the issue in the past as well, and we have been saying that Pakistan has been consistently ranked among the top 10 vulnerable countries that is likely to be affected by the effect of climate change. And you can see the floods this year. We also have seen the massive floods in 2010. So responsibilities lies on everyone, like for example on ourselves, on the West particularly. Since United Nations Chief is here, so it's a right forum to highlight this issue in front of him. He definitely have visited many areas of Pakistan to observe the suffering of the people, those people who are poor, who don't have resources to cope with these type of, not calamity, but we can say it's a calamity, it's a result of a climate change basically. So, but the West should be responsible to help this part of a nation due to three reasons. Number one, that is their ethical and moral responsibility, because they have resources, they are a rich country, they are technically advanced country. Secondly, it's a kind of their official or legal obligations to help this part of a nation, because this part of the world is suffering just because of the ugly development, or in other words, say technological advancement of the West. If you can see, the US was initially the big emitter of greenhouse gases. Now China has taken a lead, and US is at number 2. And as you mentioned earlier, Pakistan's contribution in the greenhouse gases is less than 1% compared to the rest of the world. So, but we are the big sufferer, and we have seen this thing in the form of floods, in the form of heat waves. Although, Sana, I am consistently seeing that Pakistan has been clearly declared as a water-scarce country. And you see, in the last month,
right,
in the month of monsoon, we have water everywhere. So it means Pakistan is suffering badly, directly by the effect of climate change. Why Pakistan has been suffering directly by the effect of climate change is because of two main reasons. We have massive reserves of glaciers up in the Himalayas, And with global warming, those glaciers will melt, and our 40% population on this earth will directly depend on the meltwater that is coming from these glaciers. Secondly, we have large coastline. So with glaciers melting, obviously all these ice or snow will go to the sea, and sea level will rise. So you can see the dynamics of Pakistan. So we need desperate help. And help should not only be, extended to the rehabilitation. It should go beyond. We need long-term management of, people who suffer from these floods. For example, the people whose land has been eroded by these flash floods. So they don't have any other alternate opportunities to earn. Where they will go, what they will do. So we need to formulate long-term policies to help these type of people in Pakistan.
Right, absolutely, and that's very right. And I want to talk a bit more about the kind of moral and social responsibility that you also highlighted regarding international partners, and that what needs to be done at home as well. But let me include in the conversation Muhammad Abdullah Diosab as well. And with regards to the kind of issues that you pointed out, of course, the glacial melt and the flash flooding that we've seen in the past, it seems that we have at least a baseline understanding of the kind of consequences that exist for Pakistan. However, there is of course the need of additional resources and help from our international partners. But putting that aside, there is also a lot that Pakistan can do to mitigate the effects of such disasters within our own country. Diosab, when we take a look at the past, the way that we have seen such issues occur, the way that we have at least some sort of understanding of the kind of consequences that can exist for the country in terms of such floods or glacial melts, do you think that at the domestic level, Pakistan has been able to focus and devise, plan the kind of measures that are needed, not just in terms of a disaster response, but also in terms of prevention?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I have a bit of a different opinion when it comes to that Pakistan has less than 1% of the carbon dioxide emission. Okay, maybe if we talk about the geographically about that part, that land, but if we look at the Pakistani population, it's 220 million. An average carbon footprint of a person is 4 tons per year. So if you multiply that with 220, it is more than the Scandinavian countries combined. So let me give you an example. We talk about just the carbon being released from that part of the world, Pakistan, but we're not talking about the carbon footprint, which I think I am responsible. We all are responsible. If I want to buy an iPhone, we don't manufacture it in Pakistan. It's being manufactured in the US. But let's say they make 1 million iPhones for Pakistani people, and they use the unnatural, or let's say a dirty way of producing electricity. Then who's responsible? I am, because they are manufacturing it for me. If Japan is importing us cars, and we are having like more than 2 million cars from Japan, and they're releasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are the ones responsible. It's like I'm not killing someone, but I'm paying someone to kill, and then I'm saying, oh, I'm not the culprit, it's the other one who just shot the bullet. No, we have to take responsibility in one way or the other. What we can do, we can use this as an opportunity to have our own industry here, a renewable industry. Maybe the world will see towards us. Maybe instead of going to all the trade and everything being going from west to the east, maybe even the west comes here to the Pakistan and say, okay, they have clean and green manufacturing industry. Maybe we can use that. This is the first thing. Second, this is the 25th mega flood in the 75 history of Pakistan. So no doubt there is climate change. Nobody can deny that. But I think it's more like mismanagement as well. In 2010, it was exactly the same. We had 12 years to prepare. Why didn't we prepare? And at the moment in Sindh, it's 80 billion cubic meter of water in total. And our Mangla Dam is 9 billion cubic meters, like almost 9 Mangla dams in the province of Sindh. So why we didn't prepare? Why we didn't save this water? What happened? So there are a lot of questions regarding management that need to be asked. There's not just the flash flooding. There has been torrential flooding. There has been urban flooding. There has been pluvial flooding in which the sewerage system was choked. We need to look at the example of Netherlands. In 1990, they had a devastating flood, and they decided, and they came up with this theory, room for river. And in 2007, they came up with this idea, and they decided to finally work on this idea, and they started it in the same year, in 2007. And it was a long project, which is about to be finished by the end of this year or maybe the next year. And what they did was to just move their population from that part, from those streams, and make more green spaces and open spaces for the water to flow. And they made a lot of underground water storages. I mean, we cannot have another dam on the surface of the earth. It would be like having an entire province just being given to or just being devoted for a dam. We need to work and think about the underground water storages as well. And I would like to thank the UN chief, Mr. Antonio. He said one thing which I really admired. He said instead of giving debt, we should be investing in Pakistan. We should be doing research, and I have been advocating that in my previous programs, that instead of asking for flood relief grant, why don't this time we ask for flood research grant? Because the world might not be able to help us every time. The Queen is dead, we are wearing black, and there's going to be billions of pounds which are going to be expended for printing new cash money, for printing new passports,
so that can be
for
directed
uniforms.
Yeah, right. That can be directed.
No, the thing is, they cannot give us cash all the time.
Sana, with your permission, let me explore the bit that was said earlier.
Yes,
Abdullah sir, you very intriguingly actually said that the countries that are manufacturing are actually not responsible. The countries that are consuming are. With due respect, the country that earns the capital, in Pakistan, I might import 1 million iPhones or whatever, but money is leaving this country. Another country is getting a paycheck.
They are not stealing the money. We are asking them for the services, and they're paying us.
But they're manufacturing it. They are making money. So they should also be responsible.
But they're manufacturing it for us. We're paying them to do that.
Yeah, but
we are paying them for our. If we are not even able to manufacture this small pen, we're going to import it from China.
Really,
then I think it is on us.
You have to understand.
I agree. They're not using the clean energy. But let me put this in an example.
With due respect, I totally get that we have been failing in our responsibility as well. But if we are going to actually say that a country that goes poorer because of import of certain items is going to be held responsible, then the entire model or story of colonialism stands on its head.
If you look at the scientific definition of carbon footprint, that's how it works. It has nothing to do with colonialism.
Right.
For example, if you're hungry at home and your parents didn't put any food, you're not going to say that they're responsible. You're probably going to cook yourself.
Okay. Abdullah?
Sana,
go ahead.
We'll come back to that and have a discussion on this as well. Let me just also include the conversation. Mr. Davar Bhatt has been waiting for a long time. Mr. Davar, when we take a look at the kind of issues that we face, of course, there is an understanding of the global contribution that exists. There may be, of course, a lot of individual responsibility or contribution that you can make in terms of making things better. But the fact remains when we talk about climate change on a global level, there are issues that have impacted global warming and climate change. And there are countries in the developed world that have been largely responsible for this change as well. Not to say that other countries can't do better, but when we take a look at the kind of impact that Pakistan is facing in terms of its global contribution, it seems a bit unfair, and this was of course spoken about by the UN Secretary General as well. If we take a look at the kind of issues that exist internally at home, of course, we know the kind of accountability that needs to exist and the kind of responses that we need to develop. But there's so much that needs to be done on a global level for us to be protected by the issues of climate change. And it seems that that conversation on a global level also is not something that people want to hear or talk about, and they haven't really processed this in a way that is urgent. They haven't worked on the real models on which they're actually going to achieve tangible actions. How is it that when we're taking a look at the kind of international response to climate change right now, can we actually hope for mitigating the consequences of climate change within our own country if we don't have the responsible countries stepping up?
Thank you, Sana, for bringing me into the conversation. I want to point out by starting that the numbers that have been quoted by the speaker before me are completely incorrect. Pakistan and other countries are actually bound to declare their carbon emissions, which includes the entire carbon footprint of a country. So after the Paris Climate Accord, Pakistan and every signatory of that accord declares the nationally determined contribution, which is the NDC. And according to those NDCs, Pakistan's carbon footprint in 2018 was 489 metric tons of carbon CO2 equivalent. And this includes everything. This includes methane, this includes your other sort of greenhouse gases. And the global carbon footprint is more than 50 gigatons. And that is why we say that Pakistan's contribution is less than 1%. And no matter what calculation you do, the global north, which is the European Union, the United States, Australia, these countries have historically been responsible for carbon emissions, not just this year. We need to think of going back to 2 centuries, because that's how greenhouse gases are built up into the environment. They haven't built up in a year. They've built up over the past 200 years. So the global north has taken up 90% of that emission. And this is from academic research, that 90% of the emissions in the atmosphere right now comes from the global north. And that is why we ask them and blame them for this. And this is why also when the Paris Climate Accord and every other international environment agreement was made, they came ahead and agreed that we are going to help the developing world, which they call non-annex countries, in building adaptation and mitigation, and we're going to fund it. That is where the climate finance term comes from. So this is why we ask them for resources, because this is just not us asking us for reparation. This is also a commitment that they've made. Now the UN chief coming here and highlighting this also sort of is a good thing from our perspective, but it also shows how the world has failed so far to fulfill that responsibility. The global north has committed that since 2009, the commitment is that they have to give $100 billion annually to the developing world for their mitigation purposes. Pakistan, countries like Pakistan have not received that money, and by right now, what we've seen the climate impacts, I'm pretty sure $100 billion is not going to be enough. Just building a resilience mechanism, small resilience mechanism, takes $1 billion. So this is where we stand, and asking them for resources is of course appropriate, because we have to fund our entire infrastructure and resilience projects. And of course, there's a fault on our own part as well, that we do not really efficiently use our own resources. And especially the rural and poorer parts of the country, they do not get the focus as much as urban parts. So this is where we stand, and we need to balance our own internal accountability standards and, of course, keep on asking for resources. Pakistan and other developing countries need to come together as international coalitions and go forth at these forums to demand for those resources.
Right, but David Saab, when we take a look at these international forums and the kind of demands that have been put in place before as well, and the conversations that have happened, we've seen that this push does exist in terms of how these things have been highlighted. Perhaps more countries and more people can add into this as well, but the conversation's there and it's pretty clear what needs to happen. And as you said, the issue here is that we haven't really seen the action coming in and that change happening that is required, the commitments that have been made. How is it that we can actually ensure that to happen? There is, of course, highlighting of these issues. There is, of course, people standing up and talking about this at international forums, but they seem to only have discussions, and at the end of the day, we don't really see any real actions being taken. Also, in terms of loss and damage, it seems that that's not really a part of the conversation around climate change as well. How do we bring that in?
So, just to give you a hint of why, when we say our resources have not been provided, before COVID hit, and when COVID hit, all of this climate finance and resources depleted. The world refused to give for those 2 years. No one came and funded any climate resilience projects. Just before COVID hit, Pakistan received about $400 million over the extent of a year in different projects, SDGs, clean water, sanitation, and the commitment to Pakistan, and this is a Ministry for Climate Change calculation, that of the 100 billion, because Pakistan is among the top 10 most vulnerable, our part is nearly $1.5 billion. So we've received just 1/3 of that in 1 year. And during the past 10 years, during the past 13 years since the commitment was made, that means based on the commitment that the global north has made, they owe us nearly $15 billion. And that is what we right now, because we have to calculate the entire, all the years. How we demand it is, of course, a very tricky question, because developing countries do not have the diplomatic power. They, of course, have strong populations, they have young populations, and those are good contributors in terms of labor markets. But I'll just give you an example that Maldives, Bangladesh, these countries face rising sea levels, which actually threaten their capital cities. So they have a vulnerable five forum. So they do not go as a single country to these international dialogues. They go as five countries, the V5, and that's why where they put their demands, because they have similar issues. So Pakistan needs to start as EU, the whole European Union, 28 countries together. They come ahead, and that's how they get their things done. That is how we need to get African countries on board. We need to get South Asian countries, East Asian countries, smaller nations, island nations on the same platform. And that's when we go. And of course, what do we have to give? We have other things that we can give. For example, Pakistan and other countries are bound by certain international agreements. And those are what are, for example, our bargaining chips are. That if you do not help us start funding these resources, this whole coalition of countries which are affected, they are not going to be bound by these treaties anymore. So this is how the world plays this game. And when developing countries are experiencing such great losses, that's how we have to deal diplomatically as well, that we have to be very, very strict. Very quick example again, when the 2016 Paris Agreement was being signed, India refused to sign it. India said that we still have to develop, we have a billion people to feed, why should we limit our emissions? Then they made the global north, particularly the United States, to give up patents of solar panel technology to them. And that was their bargaining chip, that you give us technology, and this is when we're going to sign the agreement. So this is what needs to be done.
Right, absolutely. Farooq, could we take a look at the kind of issues that have been highlighted by Dawesam and the proposal that he's talking about in terms of how we can lobby our interests in international forums, considering, of course, the economic situation that Pakistan currently is and how it has even increased in the aftermath of these devastating floods, and then also the political situation that exists within the country. There is, of course, a lot of issues that Pakistan has to deal with at home, both in terms of resources and in the way that we manage such disasters at home and issues at home. When we take a look at the kind of strategies and planning that are required in mitigating the impacts of such disasters, that seems to be quite lengthy, and a lot of resources and efforts need to be allocated to that. Then there's, of course, the kind of coordination between the institutions and the kind of political stability that is needed within the country, so that we can actually focus on building our infrastructure at home in terms of not just these disasters, but our institutions as well. About our position in international forums, and we have to deal with it. How do we actually have that leverage in international forums?
Right, Sana, because you started by actually mentioning or bringing up lobbying or importance of lobbying, let me actually remind everybody that President Obama has actually written how India's Prime Minister was actually trying to hide from him when this agreement was being signed, and he had to go and get him, right? And it was more or less like a raid. And that is quite a fascinating story. But apart from that as well, when you talk about lobbying efforts and the importance of lobbying, I'm not going to shoot down a very perfectly good idea. But with due respect, we have to remember that we are living in the post-Trump era. And in that era, the populism all over the world has changed the dynamics of how nations actually behave. The US actually, under President Trump, actually left Paris Accords, and then it had to actually come back later on after President Biden actually came to power. And we have seen similar kind of cases, similar kind of stories elsewhere as well in Europe. Elsewhere, we don't see the country is actually cooperating. So you can lobby, we can lobby whatever we want to, you can create some body in the UN as well, but in the end, when it comes to aid and reconstruction, you'll have to seek help from all the countries individually. I understand that multilateral institutions also play a very important role, but right now, because at this moment Pakistan is in the phase of relief and rescue, then we have to actually move towards reconstruction. And when it comes to that, perhaps we will be needing more help. And at this moment, as we have actually highlighted in the previous programs as well, $160 million flash appeal is the extent of what we actually went for. So we are getting that kind of help at this moment. Of course, once we actually step up and we look at the reconstruction efforts, then we can talk about many other things as well.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Asif, when we take a look at what is needed in terms of the response, in terms of the rescue and relief response, there's of course the issues in terms of coordination between different bodies as well. We have seen in the past that there has been a lot of concerns coming in from individuals, from organizations, from various bodies, NGOs, who obviously give their response and contribute their efforts. But then when we take a look at the way that this happens on a local scale, and then the way that bodies are actually integrated in terms of how they will actually cooperate and work together, not just in a disaster response, but also prior to that in terms of how they are prepared before such a disaster exists, seems to be something that we haven't really worked upon, or that needs a lot more attention. What do you think in terms of our understanding of the consequences of climate change and the environment and the changing patterns? Can we actually incorporate teams, bodies, and data in terms of understanding and assessing the kind of issues that exist in various places, local needs, local infrastructure, what needs to happen, and how we need to be able to coordinate that so that if there is a disaster that occurs, the extensive plan to respond to that already exists?
Sana, very important. We have to prioritize our policies, first of all. Like Abdullah Doyle talk about the carbon footprints. When we talk about carbon footprint, when we talk about that Pakistan emissions is less than 1%, we are comparing it with the rest of the world. It does not mean Pakistan does not have any emissions. But the important thing is, what is important for this country? Since Pakistan is the vulnerable country, so we need to formulate the policies that should be on the massive adaptation side, preparedness side, so that we can cope with these type of disaster. Timely responses are very important to cope with these type of disaster. Are we prepared? We are not prepared actually. What policies we have set so far to come back, to adapt ourselves to these type of climate change? How many dams we have right in Pakistan? We have only 2 dams. If we have more dams, the catastrophe would have cost much less. So this shows we are not prepared. Secondly, Sana, if you observe, we allow the buildings on the floodplains. We allow the construction of hotels on the floodplains. So obviously flood will come. If even less intensive floods will cause more damage. This is very important to understand this thing. And last thing is, now we are underwater, so everybody is discussing the flood situation, climate change. When these floods will over, nobody will talk about the climate change, about the adaptation, about the mitigation and all those things. And yes, people needs to be very clear. People needs to understand the dynamics of climate change. Climate change is a very vast thing. It's not only about the emission of greenhouse gases. It affects each and every segment of our society, and ultimately the burden will fall on the developing nation like Pakistan, or in other words, poorest of the poor will be the big sufferer. So in this stage, right now, our priority should be focused on the rescue and rehabilitation, and then long-term management, long-term management or of those people who have suffered, because you will see after that we will have a large number of environmental refugees that will come to the cities, and obviously they need some alternate income sources so they can they can survive themselves, they can earn something for their children or something like that. So this is the most important. We need to prioritize all those things in a true sense in Pakistan, particularly local level. International politics is there. Obviously, lobbying plays a very important role. But I will even go beyond that. In terms of lobbying, we need to improve our geopolitical relationship with our neighboring countries, with our South Asian countries. That's most important. Rather than every time looking at the US or UK, we need to improve our relation with India, Bangladesh, Nepal, who also become the victim of climate change. One of my colleagues mentioned that India was, not signing the Paris Accord. The reason behind that is because initially US was not signing that accord, and then Australia, and then India. But India is a kind of a developing country. So obviously these are the reasons, because this part of the region is suffering a lot compared to the West.
By the way, going back to the point that was made by Diyal Saab, whatever our responsibility is there, Sana, remember a few years ago, India actually carried out a very important water census of the entire country. They spent $3 billion, and they now have the stock of everything, right? Where what is existing and how to manage that as well. We haven't taken that kind of steps either.
Right, and that's of course very important, and something, Deosab, that you were earlier talking about in terms of research grants and what sort of research needs to exist. And even if we don't talk about just about the grants that exist, of course there is a lot of work that is happening in various fields within our own country, but it seems that perhaps issues of climate change or changing watering patterns, or as Farooq was talking about, this is not something that we have seen, and we haven't really allocated our resources towards these issues. Is it an issue of a priority, or is it really an issue of resources? Because of course when we talk about such measures that are needed, we have the capacity to do such work, don't we?
I would like to agree with Dr. Asif word to word, and I would like to extend what he said. But one thing I would like to say first, we are asking the West to give us some aid. Okay, maybe they give us 30 billion. What if it comes again next year? Are they going to pay us again? What if it comes after 5 years? Are they going to pay us again? My point is that the world is recovering from the post-COVID economy. They are having Russian-Ukraine war. They're having inflation. Now the Queen died, so there is more inflation. That was my point, because they're going to spend so much money on themselves. So I'm not pretty sure that there's going to be so much aid for us again and again. And talking about your question, it's definitely about the priority. And instead of asking them for money, what are we going to do even if they give us $100 billion? Are we going to put freezers in the Himalayas which are going to stop those glaciers from melting? No, we should be asking them to reduce their carbon footprints. And what is actually climate change? Let me tell you, this is actions, reactions. If we humans start to cut trees in our own country and start building housing societies in agricultural land, what is going to happen? There's going to be so much concrete, and which means so much carbon and cement.
Right, and Deosab, I understand that, and I agree that we need to hold those countries responsible and ask them for action, but money will.
No, I'm asking about West Pakistan. Yes, this is what I'm saying. Yes, this was I was going there. So if we are cutting trees and making so many housing societies, the cement is responsible for 8% of the global carbon emission. And in South Asia, when it comes to urbanization, Pakistan is on #1. So I think we need to make a policy how much urbanization we must do and we must not do. And we have, NDMA, Federal Flood Commission, Federal Flood Forecasting Department, and Meteorological Department. Then we have Ministry of Climate Change, IRSA, and then we have Ministry of Water Resources and Urban Planning. There are 8 ministries. I think we should be asking them questions. What have we done? And what we should do, we should be doing modeling. In the first world countries, they have this flood risk modeling, climate change modeling, in which they put this return period of 100 or 200, and it is super cheap. All you need is data. You put it in the software, you calibrate it, and it will tell you what will happen in the next 100 years. And just to map it on QGIS, this is a free software that
right,
anybody
but
can
the data
download.
collection is an important part, and we haven't really focused on that. That's the
Yes.
question.
And
Yes,
by the way,
we should focus
and,
on that and
with
make
your,
these models.
with
so
your
that we
permission,
know.
allow me to just add to the question. Because I
Yes,
keep
sir.
on hearing this bit about how Netherlands actually took care of its matters, and then of course we should actually be building bridges or connecting with our neighbors. Theoretically, I agree with all those things, but Netherlands is richer than Pakistan. We have been traditionally a cash-strapped country. Similarly, when you talk about India, Pakistan has been, I can show you repeated statements from Pakistani prime ministers, and even army chief and president calling for better relations with India. But the problem is the world doesn't move around us, it doesn't actually work according to our expectations. So how do you actually connect the theoretical part to the reality?
Okay,
Yeah.
I will answer that. So, for example, when we want to, at the moment, this climate change is a bigger threat that we had when there was terrorism. And we spent almost 30 years to build an atomic bomb. So I think just like that, we need to have a state policy for this climate change. No matter who is in the government, this state policy will not stop. And just like this is very,
And
very
you see that
important.
happening? Sorry,
No,
you
we're
see that
talking
happening?
about it should happen. And
No,
what I-
but this is the problem. My problem is when we talk about reality on ground, we forget about actual what happens. Everyone
it has
talks
to
about
happen. If it doesn't happen, then we
data
will
of
be-
economy. Nobody is ready to sit together.
Well, then nothing can happen. Maybe we can just say goodbye, good night, and go home.
Yeah.
Because nobody. We are here to discuss what should be done.
Yeah, but
And if it's not in our
the
hands,
problem with our
For example, if
experts
we
or
need-
theoreticians is that they keep on talking about the big expectations, but they don't give us easy, simple steps to take. If you do that,
No,
then
but-
you can actually do
but
something
it's in
about
our
it.
hands.
But
It's
this
not
is-
the world.
Yes, this
Right,
is not a
Farooq,
this is-
let me just quickly also get in the conversation, Mr.
Yeah.
Davar, since we're short on time.
Please.
So, Mr. Davar, when we take a look at what is, of course, needed right now, there are numerous things in terms of the steps that we can take, in terms of what internationally needs to happen. But of course, the realities of Pakistan is that it's an economically strained country. It has seen a lot of political instability in the past and still does. And there's, of course, a lot of pressure in terms of our resources. We definitely require as much help as we can. And then there's, of course, a lot of accountability that needs to exist at home in terms of what we do about it. Currently, what we're facing with is, of course, a huge catastrophe. And we don't want, of course, such a repetition in the future. But when we talk about climate change impacts, it seems that Pakistan, of course, is quite vulnerable to these issues. In terms of the most immediate efforts that can be done at the moment, of course, our own level, and in terms of how we can actually make sure that we're not part of this cycle again, where we're just contributing in terms of getting over this particular disaster, or just focusing on rescue rehabilitation, which of course is going to take years. We are not part of this cycle again. How do we do something today to contribute to not being part of this cycle tomorrow?
Will be sort of a merger of arguments from Abdullah Saab and Farooq Saab as well, because both of them
Sure,
have been
yes.
saying, both of them have been saying things that have to be done. And in Farooq Saab's point is correct in the way that when we interact with our South Asian neighbors, they are not as forth as we want them to be. And Abdullah Saab's point that we have 8 different agencies and ministries who are responsible and need to be held accountable. So this is, I think, where we start. If we cannot interact with our neighbors as effectively, we need to assess the performance of these institutions. Now, this is again a question that why did we not know that this is going to happen? If you go back to the start of July, our Met department said that we're going to have above normal rainfall, and the average that it presented was 140 millimeters all over the country. Right now, that average has been exceeded by 200 millimeter more. So we have 340 millimeter. And based on a wrong prediction, your NDMA and PDMA did not do anything. They prepared a monsoon contingency plan, which had just enough tents for 100,000 people. And now you need tents for 1 million people. So this is where accountability needs to start, that institutionally, Abdullah sir pointed out that you need to do modeling. We need to do climate modeling. We need to forecast more accurately. This was very, for the past 3 years, at least the coastal areas have been facing flooding. We routinely hear about how Karachi never received so much rain, but for the past 5 years, it's been receiving so much rain that each time the city gets flooded in August. So this is of course a changed climate pattern, and we keep on hearing that climate pattern change, and it has definitely changed. But why does not the government or the agencies have data on it? So that's one part of the accountability mechanism. The second part is you have to prepare on the basis of a forecast. So we need to ensure that NDMA has the resources and PDMAs themselves get direct access to softwares and data sets and interact with people. In the immediate term, of course, it's just provide food, shelter, and healthcare for 1 million people, 2 million people who have been displaced. And at the same time, whatever resources that we get, of course, it's not going to be a lot. Some of it has to be diverted to research and development, and that is where a lot of it is Pakistan's own responsibility. No foreign scientist is going to come here and tell you that I am going to make forecast model for you. You have these universities, you have a space agency, you have to use them. So in the next 1 year, those two things need to happen: feed the people and research.
Right. Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Davar Bhatt, for joining us, and of course, Muhammad Abdullah Theol and Dr. Asif Javed Saab, and of course, Farooq Mutafi for being a part of the debate as always. There is, of course, a lot of issues that we need to be taking a look at home, what needs to be done in terms